Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Esther in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. Well, I'd like to give you the cast of characters, four main characters in this story. The first is going to be Esther herself, also known as Hadassah. So she has two names. One is a Jewish name, one is a Persian name. Secondly, we're going to have Ahasuerus. He's the king. Most scholars believe that this is Xerxes. I'm not an expert on that aspect. I have checked with somebody who did their PhD on the book of Esther, and they tell me that Xerxes is really the only king that fits the picture when you look at the chronology. So I'm going to go on their judgment. Xerxes, that's the Greek name. Ahasuerus seems to be a title rather than a name, but that's how the king is going to be described. Next, we have Mordecai. He is the cousin. He acts more like an uncle. He's the caretaker of Esther, whose parents have died. And so he's going to play a part in the story. And then there's also Haman, and he will be the villain. Our story begins, and it begins here in the Persian Empire, and almost everything you see on the map, except for Greece on the far left-hand corner, everything else that you see on the map basically belonged to Persia. The Persian Empire, at that time in history, was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Uh, you see Jerusalem on the map. Jerusalem has been destroyed. It had not yet been rebuilt. At least the walls hadn't been rebuilt. There's people back in the land. They have their temple. But other than that, things aren't going so well there. The book of Nehemiah hasn't taken place yet. You see Babylon on the map, but Babylon is not a major city anymore. I mean, it's a major city. It's no longer the capital. The Babylonians are there, but they're no longer ruling. Now the Persians are ruling, and the Persians have their main capital at Susa. There's another one, Persepolis, but that we're not going to talk about that in this story. So the story is going to begin and end here in Susa, although events in Susa, just like events in Washington, D.C., in my country, can impact the rest of the country. Events in Susa can impact the rest of the empire. And as the story begins, the king of Persia is celebrating with a party. There's going to be a lot of parties in this book, and he decides he'd like to have his wife come and sort of display herself. I'm not sure exactly what he had in mind, but she refuses to come. And that sets up a crisis. What are you going to do when somebody disobeys the king? Well, usually it's off with your head, but he doesn't want to do that with his own wife. It has raised his ire enough where he's going to pick a new head wife, and we're going to have a beauty contest to see who that's going to be. So Esther is eventually going to be chosen out of all the contestants. Now she doesn't make it clear that she is Jewish because after all, she's just one of many people that are in the Persian Empire. She's going by the name Esther rather than Hadassah, and so she is chosen. She wins the beauty contest, and as things work out, her cousin Mordecai, who had been the one who had raised her, she had been orphaned, and he had taken her as if she was his own daughter. And he happens to be outside the palace. Now he can't go in the palace; he doesn't have that kind of ability. But he happened to be in the right place at the right time, and he overheard a plot to assassinate the emperor. And so he passed the message up the line, and the message finally got to those whose job it was to protect the emperor, and they caught the assassins, and the plot was uncovered, and the king was saved. And now we go to the next chapter, and now we have Haman, and Haman has happened to see Mordecai outside the palace. Now Haman is one of the king's advisors, um, and Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. I think maybe the idea was Mordecai didn't want to bow down to anybody but God. I'm not so sure about that, but Haman felt slighted by Mordecai, and that begins to grate. And he decides, I'm going to get at Mordecai. The problem is Mordecai hasn't been doing anything wrong. In fact, the only thing he's done so far is save the life of the king by sending that report. But Haman plots now. He comes up with a plan, and he goes to the king and he says, I know our finances are a bit low. We've done some campaigning in the way. He doesn't go into the details, but we know from history that there had been some military campaigns that hadn't gone all that well against Greece. Remember the story of how Xerxes tries to invade Greece? I think that's what had taken place. And the finances are a bit low, and so he's come up with a plan. He says there's these people, they're not very nice. Nobody really likes them. They're called the Jews. And if you proclaim open season on the Jews, you can take all of their property, all of their money. You can, and others can take it too. And we can boost the tax revenues, and we can make the empire a much better empire, and we'll all just do better without them. And the king, well, he's just interested in the money. He's not that he has this dislike or like of the Jews. He just he's easily swayed, and so he adopts Haman's plan. And the edict is published, and they're going to sort of roll the dice on when this is going to take place. Leave it up to the stars, leave it up to the God of the universe. The Persians, by the way, were monotheistic, but they weren't necessarily worshiping Yahweh. And so this edict is now published that it's still quite a ways off, but eventually it's going to be open season on the Jews. And so Mordecai now sends a message. Remember, he can't go in and see her. She's part of the harem. She's off limits to men, except for her husband. The king has a number of wives. And yes, she might be wife number one, but now that she's been appointed to that position, she doesn't see him a lot. He's got a lot of other wives in the process. And so Mordecai sends a message to Esther saying, you have to go and talk to the king about this. You're the only one that we have. And it is apparent that you have been placed for such a time as this. And you say, well, placed by whom? You see, God's not mentioned anywhere in the story. I think he's there, but he's not mentioned by name. And so the plea is made to Esther, you go and you talk to the king. And Esther, I'm not allowed to go talk to the king. I could get in serious, if I just walk in, instead of just divorcing or relegating me to wife number 2 or 3, they might actually put me to death. I'm just not allowed to take action in the presence of the king like that. But he has pled, and she says, I'll tell you what, have all the Jewish people, have everybody fast and pray for 3 days. Now, when you hear that 3 days, I've got a friend, Dr. Warren Gage, who likes to say, whenever you see 3 days in the Old Testament, look for Jesus. And maybe he's got something there. But Mordecai makes his plea to Esther. And so after the prayer, Esther responds, and she goes into the presence of the king. And now all he has to do is ignore her, and she can be taken out and strung up. But no, he treats her kindly. He says, yes, what would you like? And she invites him to a banquet. Okay. You say, why didn't he ask her? Maybe she knows the king enough to know if you want to get something from him, throw him a big party. He likes parties, and then maybe you'll get what you want. So she invites him to a banquet. Haman is invited too. Meanwhile, Haman, in anticipation of being able to string up Mordecai, he's actually got a gallows built up just outside the palace, a place where he can put Mordecai's body on display. Now, when we say gallows, we think, like where you're hung by the neck. It might be that, or it might be where they would copy the Assyrian practice of impaling somebody on a big high stake. In any sense, it's not going to be pretty. Mordecai's fate has been sealed, or so Haman thinks, and he has built the gallows in preparation for putting Mordecai to death. And so they've been invited to a banquet, and they hold the banquet, and the king says, okay, this is a really nice party. I'm glad for this. Is there something you want? And Esther says, I'd like to invite you to another banquet. You say, well, did Esther chicken out? Was it just a case of nerves she didn't have, or was it a case of knowing the king? I need to really butter him up a bit. Again, we're not told the specifics. So banquet number one was to invite you to banquet number two, but that's going to be the next day. And that night, the king cannot sleep. Now, what happens when you can't sleep? Now, I've tried a number of things. These days, one thing I'll do sometimes is I'll put on an audio book or an audio lecture. And if it's really interesting, that actually works against me because it might keep me up. But if it's boring enough, honestly, there was this one lecture from way back in my undergraduate studies. This one professor that could put me to sleep within about 5 minutes if I listened to his lectures at night. Now I don't have anything quite like that. Maybe I could dig up one of those lectures again and try that. But the king can't sleep, and so he does the same thing. Now they didn't have audio recorders, so what he does is he has somebody come in and read to him from the royal reports, the royal histories, and usually that's pretty boring, except that the reader happens to read about the assassination attempt on the king. And all of a sudden he sits up and that sort of got his adrenaline going. And he says, did we happen to reward the person who reported this and the person who led to saving my life? What's his name? Yeah, let's see. His name is Mordecai. Well, did we reward him? Well, no, there's nothing in the Chronicles that says we did that. Okay, well, just remind me in the morning. So the morning comes, and and Haman is called in by the king, and the king says to Haman, "What could we do for somebody who has been of great profit to my kingdom, to me personally?" Now Haman has come up with this tax plan, and he's thinking, "Oh, goody, I'm going to get rewarded by the king." And he says, "Here's what you do: you take the king's clothes and you dress this person up like a king, and you put the king's ring on his finger, and you put him in your chariot. You make him look like you, like the king of all the Persian Empire." And the king says, "That's a great idea. I want you to do that for Mordecai." and Haman is like, "Oh, I didn't plan on that." Now, the the party now takes place, the second banquet. And it's at this banquet, the king says, "Okay, well, I'm having a great time. I love parties. Here's another party. Um, what's this all about?" And Esther says, "I want to let you know there is a plot against the king." Now, they've been talking about plots and rewarding somebody, and now the Esther says there's a plot, and it's coming indirectly. It's not to put you to death, but it's to embarrass you by putting your main queen to death. What do you mean? What's this about? Well, the plot is to destroy all Jews, and I happen to be Jewish. I mean, I'm a subject of the Persian Empire, but that's made up of a lot of different people. And so it's indirectly a plot against you. I think the idea is there. And the king, he says, "Well, I'm going to go see about that." And he goes out of the room. And Haman is hearing this, and he realizes he's at the center of this quote unquote plot. And he goes to Esther and he takes her hand. And he says, "Please, you need to save me and do something for me." And the king walks back in, and here's this fellow grabbing the king's, like grabbing the king's wife. What's that about? You can't do that sort of thing. What are you trying to do? Attack my wife? You're not allowed to touch her. She's untouchable. What's going on here? Guards, guards. And the guards come up and say, "By the way, we've got a gallows outside." "Oh, put him on it." And Haman gets placed and killed on the gallows that he had intended for Mordecai. See how everything sort of depended on the sleepless night. Everything was going bad up to the sleepless night. And from here on, everything's going good. And the first good thing is Haman is out of the way. And now a plea is made to the king about this upcoming plan to declare open season on the Jews. And the king says, "Well, I can't really go back on once I publish an edict, it has to go forward. That's just our way of doing things." Um, and so the edict is out there, but Mordecai suggests, and he's been brought in now as an advisor, first of all, to reward him, but hey, Haman is on the gallows, so Mordecai is brought in, and he suggests, well, you could publish a second edict Yes, it's open season on Jews, but the Jews are allowed to fight back. They're allowed to defend themselves. And that's exactly what, the king goes along with it, and that's what goes forward. And so the Jews are saved, and Mordecai is now elevated to a position of advisor to the king. And the end of the story, that's chapter 9, but then the very end of the story in chapter 9 and early part of chapter 10 is very short, is how this becomes a regular celebration, a party where the Jews celebrate. And by the way, they were able to destroy many of their enemies. When it became open season on the Jews were able to fight back, and those who had been anti-Semitic and who had sought to kill Jews, they themselves throughout the empire, and there's a lot of them that are put to death. And so the Jews celebrate this story. And they do it every year. Now it's at the end of the Jewish religious year, which usually takes place around February or so, maybe March, depending on where the moon is that year. It's a lunar calendar. And so they celebrate Purim, the casting of the lots, because the lot had been cast as to what date it was going to be. That's what the word pur is. It's the word for lot. And they celebrate, and the king celebrates, and everyone celebrates. And to this day, every year, they celebrate that time when they were under the threat of death. And yet, they were saved. And they recognize, even though he's not mentioned in the story, that it's God who saved them. In Esther chapter 9 and verse 24, we read, "For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite," and he's called this about 6 times throughout the book of Esther. Haman, the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and to destroy them. But notice Haman is called the Agagite. Now, that term Agag, an Agagite would be a descendant of somebody named Agag, and he's called that as early as Esther chapter 3. Agag, if you'll remember from our earlier study, was the king of the Amalekites whose life Saul had spared in disobedience to the command of God. He was the enemy of the people of God. Now you say, is this the same Agag? I'm not going to say that for sure because I don't know that. But it is the same name. I want you to at least hear the name and either its actual or at least symbolic significance. Agag. And here's Haman, his descendant, in name at least, if not in actuality. Mordecai, meanwhile, in Esther chapter 2, verse 5, when she was introduced, Mordecai's from the family and tribe of Saul. So I have the descendant of Saul, actually, not just the name, up against the name and maybe the actual descendant of Agag. I have these two stories. The story from way back in 1 Samuel, where Samuel had said, "Get rid of the Amalekites, the people of Agag, because they're going to come back and haunt you." And here they do, because Saul did not. You have Mordecai and Esther too, really, acting as the savior of the people of God. God's doing the work, but they're the tools that are going to be used against this enemy of God's people. And remember, if Agag wins, if Haman wins, then there's no more Jewish people because he wants to kill them all. And if there's no more Jewish people, there's no future Messiah because the Messiah had to be Jewish. And there's no Messiah. And if there's no Messiah, you die and go to hell in your sins. So this is your story of salvation as well. So some points to ponder. Esther is the book of God's providence. God's not mentioned in the book, but his fingerprints are all throughout. The success of Haman's plot would also exterminate the seed through which Messiah would come. That's what we just said. And the book reminds us that God works in the lives of both the great and the ones that we think of as small, just ordinary people, which Esther and Mordecai had been earlier, just ordinary people in the right place and at the right time. Now, this is a picture of Jesus as well. We have Esther, who is the virgin bride who eventually married the king. And we as the church are the spotless bride and we marry the king. In the Esther story, we have the king's former wife had been displeasing and been set aside. And there's a sense in which Paul says in Romans chapter 11, the natural branches were broken off due to unbelief. That doesn't mean the church replaces Israel, but it means that the Gentiles become engrafted into something that earlier had been Jewish, and it grows. This tree grows and continues to grow. In the Esther story, Haman plotted against Mordecai and against all the Jews. In the Jesus story, we have Satan himself who set himself up against Christ and against all people. He's the tempter and the enemy. In the Esther story, Mordecai convinces Esther to intercede on behalf of her people. In our story, Jesus himself, we read, intercedes on behalf of his people, on behalf of the church. In the Esther story, Esther agrees to intercede after the people have fasted for 3 days. And we have a Savior who interceded on our behalf and then was in the grave for 3 days before rising from the dead. In the Esther story, Haman plans to have Mordecai executed for not bowing down to him. Remember that Jesus was tempted by Satan to worship him, and Satan's attack culminated upon the cross, where Jesus died on our behalf. In the Esther story, Haman met his end on the gallows that he had intended for Mordecai. In the Jesus story, Jesus intentionally went to the cross that had been prepared for us. The cross, he died the death we deserved so that we could live the life that he has that we don't deserve, that we receive through faith in him. In both cases, that which looked like certain death and defeat was turned into ultimate victory. And that means you can celebrate as well.